in public discourse, then without self-pity, I think we should say that we too can be offended and insulted. I mean, I'm not just in disagreement when someone like Tariq Ramadan, accepted now at the high tables of Oxford University as a spokesman, says the most he'll demand when it comes to the stoning of women is a moratorium on it. I find that profoundly much more than annoying.
Right, yeah.
Insulting, not only insulting, but actually threatening.
But you're not offended. This is, you don't take any, I don't see you taking things personally. You're alarmed by the liabilities of certain ways of thinking, as in Ramadan's case.
But he would say, or people like him would say, that if I doubt the historicity of the Prophet Muhammad, I've injured them in their deepest feelings.
Right.
Well, I am, in fact, I think all people ought to be offended, at least in their deepest integrity, by, say, the religious proposition that without a supernatural celestial dictatorship we wouldn't know right from wrong. That we only live by.
But are you really offended by that? Doesn't it just seem wrong?
No, I say only, Sam, that if the offensiveness charge is to be allowed in general and arbitrated by the media, then I think we're entitled to claim that much without being self-pitying or representing ourselves as an oppressed minority, which I think is an opposite danger, I will admit. I'd like to add also that I agree with Daniel that there's no way in which the charge against us can be completely avoided, because what we say does offend the very core of any serious religious person at any rate. If we deny the divinity of Jesus, for example, many people will be terrifically shocked and possibly hurt. It's just too bad.
Well, I was thinking of saying this to the previous question. I mean, I'm in some ways the wrong person to ask these questions, because I'm no longer a joiner up of groups. I don't feel the belonging need anymore. I used to when I was younger and more left than I am now, feel the need to be involved in an organized way. Now I don't, and I think I probably have more influence as an individual than I ever did as a cogwheel in a so-called party. A point for anyone to ponder, actually, who's asked, have they ever considered registering independent, for example? People may fight harder for your vote if you don't give it away in advance. Separate question. And it's very important to me that I don't belong to a church. People who believe as I believe don't need to get together all the time and remind ourselves what we believe, reinforce it, ram it home, in case we forget the incredible propositions that we're singing and all this kind of thing. You just recognize a fellow freethinker when you meet one. That should be enough, and in any country or any language as well. There will be in Washington in October the big gathering where Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and myself and many others are going to be. Victor Stenger, because there has been an extraordinary vogue of successful books on this subject now, and I think there's a change in the zeitgeist going on about religion. And let me just say this: if that zeitgeist has been brought about, if a change has been brought about in that zeitgeist, it hasn't been by any organization.
If you mean in the United States, I think that the study of the founding of the country, the emergence of the United States as the world's first and only, still only, secular democratic republic, federal republic, is terribly understudied these days. The likelihood that there wouldn't ever have been a revolution if there hadn't been a inter-imperialist fight between England, Spain, and France. The likelihood that it could have been just a rebellion of colonies wanting to hold on to their old English privileges. The extraordinary odds against there being an Enlightenment revolution sponsored by people like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson, who really believed that the United States should declare not just for its own rights, but for the rights of all men, which is the great breakthrough, based on the writing of John Locke and other Enlightenment figures, is the most ignored and underemphasized. Instead, we get happy stories about George Washington crossing the Delaware and matters of this kind that are later replaced by the stories of Parson Weems about George Washington being a moral hero and a sort of Superman, which don't show the grit and the grain of how revolutionary our revolution was. If I could change one thing, it would certainly be that. The Theodore Draper's book, A Struggle for Power, which is a very good history of the germinal events without which the American Revolution couldn't have taken place or would have taken a different form.
Don't be too hard on her. I mean, she didn't write that piece, and she probably hasn't even read it. I doubt she could either read or write it.
I bet you wonder if she's read Going
piece about this the other day. So everything she does is for effect. And it's always deniable. She can switch back in a minute. At the moment, she thinks that her Tea Party crowd want to hear this kind of thing, so she'll say that. She's been out to say, well, I don't know, but I think the president ought to produce his birth certificate. I'm not saying that it isn't a good question. Then later, because she's got to go to the gridiron dinner in Washington and learn how to use a knife and fork, be taught by Fred Malek. She takes it back. No, I think she's a disgraceful opportunist and a real moral coward.
I'm addressing the point about the non-overlapping magisteria. Whether is it really true that there's an incompatibility between science and religion, or can they rub along? Let's help with the assisted suicide of this fatuous proposition and show that there's a radical incompatibility. Let's assume that we've only been around for 100,000 years, in the course of which time people were born, most of them, a good number of them at any rate, a high proportion of them dying in the process of being born, or killing their mothers in that process, live for many, many, many thousands and thousands of years, probably not longer than 2.5 decades, eventually dying either of their dentition, which they didn't understand, or of microorganisms that they didn't know existed, meanwhile conducting vicious and venomous turf wars with each other, almost invariably carrying rival fetishes into the fray to demonstrate their moral superiority over others, and that this went on with all its attendant misery and gruesomeness, perhaps with a slow upward curve towards the magnificent mammals that we are today, superb primates that constitute species. And that's how it looked, that's how it was. And heaven watched that with folded arms for 94,000 years. And then about 6,000 years ago, it's time to intervene. In or around Bronze Age Palestine, by means of various human sacrifices. Now, I couldn't without difficulty be brought to believe in a virgin birth. It would take a lot to make me believe in that. I do think, apparently there is such a thing as parthenogenesis. I don't really believe in resurrection, though according to the Bible it was very commonplace at the time. No big trick to it. All the graves opened at the time of the crucifixion and the inhabitants got out and walked around Jerusalem, according to St. Matthew. So what's so important about just one more? But I could be brought to believe in this. I can't be brought to believe in the hypothesis that I've just given you. That cannot be true. It cannot be true. It is flat out not true. And if it were true, it would mean, as all such religious hypotheses do, that we won that argument too, because that's either a very bad design, a very inept and stupid one, or it's a very wicked and evil one. So that, I think, is a QED. And I thought I might pass that on to you, or as they say in some of the religious communities where I go, share it with you. Though I do, in fact, know a bit about religion and other people's religions, I sort of have forced myself to find out now what has been forced upon me. My test is this. I don't want to have to know what your religion is. I live in the United States of America. You can have any religion you want as long as you can keep it to yourself. But the moment I have to hear about it, or you want it taught in my school to my kids, or produced in the public square with taxpayers' money, or you object to anyone criticizing it, especially if you back that even with the hint of a tiny threat of violence, you have made in me a mortal enemy. And I'll keep my part of that pact if you will keep yours.
That a new heaven and new earth will be created. Genesis is paradise lost. Revelation is paradise restored.
It sounds fatuous to me, I've got to say.
Again, how do you get something?
I am not the one who has to answer the question. Excuse me, you're the one who has to answer the question. You're the one who claims to know. You say there was a creation moment and a creator. I want to know why you're changing the subject and saying to me, how do I not know this? When you're the one who has all the information. I also want to know, I also want to know this. I want to know what sources you have that are not available to me. How do you know that an intervention will occur to prevent the entropy and implosion and destruction of our solar system?
If you want to go to our second debate, I'll provide that. Well, but what I'm saying is, let's say there's no intervention. Let's say there's no intervention. We go to heat death. Does that mean that the universe was not created and not designed?
It doesn't entail that belief, no, but it makes it,
okay, so what's your point?
Makes it seem a very capricious designer. Shall we say, rather as I said, it's an old verse of Phil Greville's, created sick, commanded to be well. Why would people be told, okay, I can create you, but I'm going to create you with original sin, misery, shame, death of children, disease, and so on, just to see if you can pass a test that would mean I might not send you to hell. I don't say that that didn't happen. I say that I'm very glad that the evidence for it is very scanty. And I accuse those who do believe it, and I can't have been surely misunderstood on this point, of harboring a very sinister desire to live in a totalitarian system.
How do you define sinister?
Mr. Hitchens.
The desire to be a slave.
Is that,
masochism,
is
I think.
That,
I regard masochism.
In your brain,
I regard
or is there
masochism.
Something beyond you that.
I'll say that I think masochism is a sinister and creepy impulse. Yes.
Mr. Hitchens. Question for Dr. Cherry.
All right. I won't take a minute to ask. I don't just support and try and help out those who dissent from the ridiculous belief of Christianity, the horrible idea of vicarious redemption. In other words, the idea that by watching another person suffer, an innocent person suffer, that you could be freed not just from your debts or your sins, but your responsibilities. You could cast your sins on a scapegoat. I don't just oppose that disgusting belief. I oppose the Judaism from which it's plagiarized and the Islam that plagiarizes from it. And I give publicity and exposure whenever I can to those who were brave enough in old times to oppose this nightmarish belief. And one of the great opponents of the Islamic totalitarianism in ancient Persia was the great Omar Khayyam, perhaps the greatest poet of old Persia, whose Rubaiyat, I'm sure, is known at least to some of you. And my favorite verse of this comes from the Robert Le Gallienne translation, and it takes the form of a question. The quatrain is in the form of a question. It says, "And do you think that unto such as you, a maggot-minded, starved, fanatic crew, God gave a secret and denied it me? Well, well, what matters it? Believe that too." To this magnificent astronomer and scientist and physician and humanist of Persia, who opposed the cruel, sadistic, verminous, ignorant mullahs of his day, I borrow the question, what is your authority for saying that you know something that I don't?
Long before modern inquiry and painstaking translation and excavation had helped enlighten us, it was well within the compass of a thinking person to see that the revelation at Sinai and the rest of the Pentateuch was an ill-carpentered fiction, bolted into place well after the non-events that it fails to describe convincingly or even plausibly. Intelligent schoolchildren have been upsetting their teachers with innocent but unanswerable questions ever since Bible study was instituted. The self-taught Thomas Paine has never been refuted since he wrote, while suffering dire persecution by French Jacobin anti-religionists, to show that these books are spurious, and that Moses is not the author of them, and still further, that they were not written in the time of Moses, nor till several hundred years afterwards, that they are an attempted history of the life of Moses and of the times in which he is said to have lived, and also of the times prior thereto, written by some very ignorant and stupid pretenders several hundred years after the death of Moses, as men now write histories of things that happened, or are supposed to have happened, several hundred or several thousand years ago.